The evening rush at Giovanni's restaurant was in full swing. Waiters hurried between tables carrying steaming plates of pasta and fresh bread. The warm glow of candlelight danced across white tablecloths while soft jazz played in the background. Well-dressed couples and business groups filled nearly every seat in the upscale dining room. Daniel stood outside the large windows, watching the scene inside. His stomach growled loudly. When was the last time he had eaten? Yesterday morning, maybe. Or was it the day before? The days seemed to blur together lately. He pressed his weathered hand against the cool glass and took a deep breath. His reflection stared back at him. The man looking back hardly resembled the person he used to be. His dark hair was longer than it should be, slightly messy from sleeping rough. His jacket, once a deep navy blue, now showed signs of wear and countless nights spent outdoors. The holes in his shoes let in the Chicago wind, and his fingernails needed a good cleaning. But his hands, despite everything, his hands still looked like they belonged to someone who understood delicate work. Long fingers that moved with purpose, even when he was just standing still. Daniel gathered his courage and pushed open the heavy glass door. A small bell chimed as he entered. The warm air hit his face immediately, carrying the rich smell of garlic and fresh basil. His stomach twisted with hunger. The hostess, a young woman with perfectly styled blonde hair, looked up from her reservation book. Her smile faded slightly when she saw him. She glanced around quickly, probably wondering if anyone else had noticed. Excuse me, she said in a polite but firm voice. Are you here for a reservation? Daniel shook his head. No, I was hoping to speak with the manager. The hostess hesitated. She looked him up and down again, taking in his appearance. Is there a problem with something? No problem at all, Daniel said quietly. I just have a question to ask. Behind the hostess, Daniel could see the dining room buzzing with activity. A large black piano sat in the far corner, silent and elegant. Its surface gleamed under the soft lights. Daniel's eyes lingered on it for a moment. Let me get him for you, the hostess said. She disappeared through a doorway marked staff only. While he waited, Daniel became aware of the stairs. A couple at a nearby table had noticed him and were whispering to each other. The woman kept glancing over while pretending to read the wine menu. At another table, a group of young men in expensive suits had stopped their conversation entirely. Is that guy lost? One of them said, not bothering to lower his voice much. Probably looking for a handout, another replied. They always come to the nice places. Daniel's face burned with embarrassment, but he kept his eyes forward. He had learned to ignore such comments over the past few months. Words couldn't hurt as much as an empty stomach. A short, heavy-set man in a white shirt and black tie emerged from the back. This had to be the manager. He had the look of someone who had worked in restaurants his whole life, confident, alert, and slightly tired around the eyes. I'm Vincent, the manager here, the man said, extending his hand. How can I help you? Daniel shook his hand firmly. My name is Daniel. I know this might sound strange, but I was wondering if I could play your piano. Vincent's eyebrows went up. Play the piano? Yes, sir. In exchange for a meal. I'm a pianist and I haven't eaten in quite some time. The honesty in Daniel's voice seemed to catch Vincent off guard. The manager looked toward the piano, then back at Daniel. Several customers were now openly staring at their conversation. You're a pianist? Vincent asked. I am, or I was. I still am, I guess. Daniel's voice carried a strange mix of pride and sadness. I know I don't look like much right now, but I can play. Really play. Vincent studied Daniel's face. There was something in the man's eyes that spoke of education, of a life that had once been different. When's the last time you played? It's been a while, Daniel admitted. But it's not something you forget. Like riding a bicycle, you know. A burst of laughter came from the table of young businessmen. One of them was clearly telling a joke, but the timing made Daniel wonder if they were laughing at him. He tried not to let it show on his face. Vincent noticed the stares too. He was torn between his natural compassion and his responsibility to maintain the restaurant's atmosphere. Giovanni's had a reputation to uphold, but something about this stranger intrigued him. What kind of music do you play? Vincent asked. Classical mostly. Some jazz. Whatever people want to hear. And you're asking for just a meal? That's all? Daniel nodded. Just something to eat. I'm not asking for money. Just food. The request was so simple and humble that Vincent felt something stir in his chest. In his 20 years running restaurants, he had heard all kinds of stories. But there was something different about this man. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, even in his current state. There was dignity there, buried under the rough exterior. "Our piano is a very expensive instrument," Vincent said carefully. "It's a 1925 Steinway. Costs more than most people's cars." "I understand," Daniel said. "I'll be very careful with it." From across the room, a woman at table 12 was getting impatient. She kept looking over and tapping her fingers on the table. Her husband was checking his watch. They had probably been waiting for their appetizer. Vincent made a decision. "Okay, here's what we'll do. You can play, but just for 30 minutes. If the customers complain, you'll have to stop. And if you damage anything—" "I won't damage anything," Daniel said quickly. "I promise. All right then. Let me get you set up." Vincent walked toward the piano, gesturing for Daniel to follow. As they crossed the dining room, conversations quieted. All eyes were on them now. Daniel heard whispers following in their wake. "What's he doing? Is that homeless guy really going to play piano? This should be interesting. I hope he knows what he's doing." The woman at table 12 flagged down a waiter. "Excuse me, what's going on over there?" "The manager is letting that gentleman play piano, ma'am." She looked shocked. "Are you serious? We're paying good money to eat here, not to listen to some street musician." Daniel heard every word. His face grew hot again, but he kept walking. Vincent opened the piano bench and gestured to the keys. "There you go," Vincent said. "It's all yours." Daniel sat down slowly on the bench. He adjusted the height carefully, the way a professional would. His hands hovered over the keys for a moment without touching them. The entire restaurant seemed to be holding its breath. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as they hovered over the pristine black and white keys. The silence in the restaurant felt heavy. Like a thick blanket had been thrown over the entire room. Forks stopped clicking against plates. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the kitchen seemed quieter. He could feel dozens of eyes burning into his back. Some curious, some doubtful, and others clearly annoyed. This wasn't what these people had signed up for when they made their dinner reservations. At table 7, a middle-aged businessman in a crisp gray suit leaned toward his dinner companion. $20 says he can't even play Happy Birthday," he whispered, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. His friend, a woman with perfectly styled red hair, giggled behind her wine glass. "You're being generous. I give him 30 seconds before Vincent has to shut this down." Daniel heard them clearly. The piano was positioned so that sound carried throughout the restaurant, which meant he could catch most of what people were saying. He tried to focus on the keys in front of him, but the whispers seemed to grow louder. "Mom, why is that scary man sitting at the piano?" a young girl asked from table 15. "Shh, honey," her mother replied, pulling the child closer. "Don't stare. He's just confused." The group of young businessmen who had been making jokes earlier were now fully engaged in the entertainment. One of them, wearing an expensive watch that caught the light, pulled out his phone. "This is going to be epic," he said to his friends while opening his camera app. "Wait until you guys see this. Homeless piano concert at Giovanni's. This is definitely going viral." His buddy, a tall guy with slicked back hair, was already recording. "Make sure you get his face. And the reactions when he crashes and burns. Should we be filming this?" asked the third member of their group, a younger man who looked less comfortable with the situation. "Are you kidding?" "This is comedy gold," the first one replied. "Plus, it's a public place. We can film whatever we want." Vincent stood nearby, wringing his hands nervously. He was already second-guessing his decision. The last thing his restaurant needed was bad publicity or upset customers. But something about Daniel made him want to give the man a chance. A waiter approached Vincent with a worried expression. "Boss, table 12 is asking for their check. They said they don't want to listen to whatever's about to happen. And table 3 wants to know if they can move to the private dining room," another server added. Vincent looked around the restaurant. About half the customers seemed genuinely curious about what would happen next. The other half looked like they were watching a car accident about to happen. Daniel finally placed his hands on the keys but didn't press down yet. The piano felt familiar under his fingers, like greeting an old friend. The weight of the keys, the smooth texture of the ivory and ebony, the perfect positioning of everything. It had been so long since he had touched a real piano, not the broken, out-of-tune instruments he sometimes found. "Is he even going to play?" someone called out from the back of the restaurant. Maybe he forgot how. Another voice replied, followed by quiet laughter. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. In his mind, he could hear his old teacher's voice from 20 years ago. Music isn't about impressing people, Daniel. It's about connecting hearts. When you sit at that piano, you're not just playing notes. You're sharing a piece of your soul. But that was a different life. A different Daniel. The man sitting at this piano had lost almost everything. His career, his home, his confidence. Even his faith in himself had cracked and crumbled over the past year. "Come on, man," one of the businessmen said, still recording. "We don't have all night." The woman at table 12 was getting more agitated. She had pulled out her own phone and was typing furiously, probably leaving a bad review online before anything had even happened. "This is exactly why I don't come to places like this anymore," she said to her husband. "You never know what kind of circus they're going to turn it into." Her husband was more patient. "Let's just see what happens, Helen. Maybe he's actually good. Look at him, Richard. Does he look like someone who can play piano in a place like this?" Daniel could hear every word. Each comment felt like a small weight being added to his shoulders. The doubt in the room was so thick he could almost taste it. A teenage girl at table 9 was live streaming on her social media. "Okay, guys, so I'm at this fancy restaurant right now, and they're letting this homeless guy play piano. This is either going to be amazing or a total disaster. I'm betting on disaster." Her phone screen showed dozens of laughing emojis and comments from her followers. "Play something." Someone shouted from across the room. "Yeah, we're waiting," another voice added. The pressure was building. Daniel could feel sweat forming on his forehead despite the restaurant's comfortable temperature. His mouth was dry and his stomach was cramping from hunger. Part of him wanted to just walk away, to avoid the embarrassment that seemed inevitable. But then he thought about the last time he had eaten a real meal. And the time before that. And the cold nights sleeping on park benches, wondering how his life had fallen apart so completely. Vincent approached the piano cautiously. "Take your time," he said quietly so only Daniel could hear. "Don't let them rush you." Daniel nodded gratefully. Vincent's kindness meant more than the manager probably realized. "Is this performance art or something?" the businessman with the gray suit asked loudly. "Because if it is, I don't get it." More laughter rippled through the restaurant. Someone started slow clapping sarcastically. The young man who had been filming zoomed in on Daniel's face. "Look at him, guys. He's completely frozen. I don't think he actually knows how to play." "Maybe we should give him some requests," his friend suggested. "How about chopsticks? That seems about his speed." Even some of the staff were starting to look uncomfortable. A waiter dropped his eyes when Daniel glanced his way. The hostess was fidgeting with her reservation book, clearly wishing she had never let Daniel inside. Daniel's hands were still hovering over the keys. In his mind, he could hear the music he wanted to play. Beautiful, complex melodies that had once flowed from his fingers like water. But between his mind and his hands was a canyon of doubt, carved deeper by every whisper and laugh in the room. "This is painful to watch," someone muttered. "Should we call someone? He might need help," another voice suggested. The teenage girl was still streaming. "Okay, so he's been sitting there for like 5 minutes now and hasn't played a single note. This is actually getting kind of sad." Daniel took a deep breath. He thought about his old life, when he would walk onto concert stages to thunderous applause, when his hands would dance across keys while hundreds of people listened in respectful silence, when music was his language and the piano was his voice. But that was then. This was now. He pressed down on the first key. The first note hung in the air like a crystal drop of water catching sunlight, pure, clear, and impossibly beautiful. Daniel's finger had barely touched the key, but the sound that emerged seemed to fill every corner of Giovanni's restaurant. Then came the second note. And the third. What started as a simple melody quickly became something magical. Daniel's right hand began to dance across the higher keys while his left hand provided a gentle, rolling foundation in the bass. The music wasn't anything anyone recognized at first, but it didn't matter. Every note seemed to flow naturally into the next, like a conversation between old friends. The businessman in the gray suit had been reaching for his wine glass when the music started. His hand froze halfway there, the glass forgotten. His mouth fell open slightly as he realized what he was hearing. That's actually really good," he whispered to his companion. The woman with red hair had stopped laughing entirely. She set down her wine glass with trembling fingers and leaned forward. trying to understand how the homeless-looking man at the piano was creating such beauty. Daniel's hands moved with impossible grace. His fingers seemed to know exactly where each key was without him even looking. Years of training and practice had built these movements into his muscle memory so deeply that poverty and hardship couldn't erase them. The melody grew more complex. Daniel's left hand began playing intricate patterns that wove underneath the main theme like golden thread through silk. The music rose and fell like ocean waves, sometimes gentle and peaceful, sometimes powerful and dramatic. The teenage girl who had been live streaming stopped talking to her phone entirely. Her viewers were typing frantic questions in the chat, asking who this person was and how he learned to play like that. But she couldn't look away from the piano long enough to read them. "Mom," the young girl at table 15 whispered, tugging on her mother's sleeve. "The music is so pretty." Her mother, who had been worried about the strange man just minutes before, found herself wiping away a tear. "Yes, sweetheart. It really is." The group of businessmen had put away their phones. The one who had been recording realized his hands were shaking too much to hold the camera steady anyway. This wasn't the comedy show they had expected. This was something else entirely. "How is he doing that?" one of them asked quietly. "I don't know," his friend replied, "but I feel like I should apologize for something." Vincent stood near the kitchen entrance, completely stunned. In all his years running restaurants, he had never experienced anything like this. The entire atmosphere of his establishment had transformed in a matter of minutes. The elegant dining room had become a concert hall, and every customer was getting a private performance from what was clearly a master musician. Daniel's eyes were closed now. The music seemed to be pouring out of him like water from a broken dam. This was the first time in months that he had felt truly alive. His fingers found notes and combinations he hadn't played in years, but they came back to him as naturally as breathing. The melody shifted into something even more beautiful. Daniel began to play variations on the main theme, each one more elaborate than the last. His right hand flew across the keys with lightning speed, while his left hand provided a steady, heartbeat rhythm that seemed to sync with everyone's pulse. A waiter carrying a tray of desserts had stopped dead in his tracks halfway across the dining room. He stood there holding the tray, afraid that even the soft sound of his footsteps might disturb what was happening. The woman at table 12, who had been so angry about the disruption, was now leaning forward with tears streaming down her face. The music had touched something deep inside her, something she hadn't felt in years. "Richard," she whispered to her husband. "This is extraordinary." Her husband could only nod. He was a practical man who rarely showed emotion, but something about the music was breaking down walls he had built around his heart decades ago. Daniel's playing grew even more passionate. The notes seemed to tell a story without words, a story of loss and hope, of falling down and getting back up, of finding beauty in the darkest places. Everyone in the restaurant could feel it, even if they couldn't put it into words. An elderly woman at table 6 had closed her eyes and was swaying gently to the music. She had taught piano for 40 years before retiring, and she recognized technique when she heard it. This wasn't just someone who had taken a few lessons. This was conservatory-level playing. This was the kind of skill that took decades to develop. "Incredible," she murmured to herself. "Simply incredible." The kitchen staff had started gathering in the doorway to listen. Cooks and dishwashers who had been rushing to keep up with dinner orders now stood quietly, their work forgotten. Even the head chef, a temperamental man who never stopped moving during dinner service, stood perfectly still. Daniel's hands moved faster now, playing runs and trills that should have been impossible for fingers that hadn't touched a piano regularly in months. But somehow they remembered. His body remembered. The music that lived inside him had just been waiting for a chance to come out. The melody reached a crescendo that seemed to lift everyone in the room. Several people were crying openly now, not from sadness but from the overwhelming beauty of what they were experiencing. The music spoke to something universal in all of them, the part that longed for beauty, for connection, for meaning. Then just as suddenly as it had built up, the music became gentle again. Daniel's hand slowed down, playing softer now like a lullaby. The notes seemed to float in the air, each one perfect and pure. A businessman at table 4 realized he was holding his breath. He exhaled slowly, afraid to make any sound that might disturb the spell that had been cast over the room, the young man who, had been so eager to film everything for social media was now questioning everything he thought. He knew about judging people. How had they all been so wrong? How had they looked at this man and seen only his shabby clothes and unkempt appearance, missing the incredible talent that lived inside him? Daniel opened his eyes for a moment and saw the faces staring back at him. Gone was the mockery and doubt. Gone were the smirks and whispered jokes. Instead, he saw wonder, respect, and something that looked almost like reverence. A little boy at table 2 had climbed onto his chair to get a better view of the piano. His parents, who would normally tell him to sit down, were too mesmerized to notice. The music continued to weave its magic through the restaurant. Daniel's fingers found new melodies within the original theme, each variation more beautiful than the last. He was no longer playing for a meal or trying to prove himself to skeptical diners. He was playing because the music demanded to be played, because it had been trapped inside him for too long. Vincent felt like he was witnessing something historic. This wasn't just dinner entertainment. This was art in its purest form, performed by someone who clearly belonged on the world's greatest stages, not begging for food in restaurants. As Daniel played, one question began forming in everyone's mind. Who was this man and how had he ended up here? The music continued to flow from Daniel's fingers like liquid gold. He had transitioned into a piece that seemed to blend classical technique with something more modern and personal. Every note was placed with surgical precision, yet the overall effect was pure emotion. The elderly woman at table 6 couldn't stay seated any longer. Professor Catherine Mills had taught piano at the Chicago Conservatory for over 30 years before retiring. She had trained dozens of students who went on to play with major orchestras around the world. And right now she was witnessing something that made her heart race. She knew this level of playing. She knew what it took to achieve this kind of mastery. More importantly, something about the way Daniel's hands moved across the keys was triggering a memory from long ago. Catherine stood up slowly, her dinner forgotten. She walked closer to the piano, her trained ear picking up subtleties that others might miss, the way he shaped each phrase, the particular fingering he used for certain passages, the slight pause he made before transitioning between sections. It can't be, she whispered to herself. Daniel was now playing what sounded like Chopin, but with his own interpretation that made it fresh and alive. His left hand provided a foundation that was both powerful and delicate, while his right hand sang out melodies that seemed to speak directly to everyone's soul. Catherine moved even closer. The candlelight from nearby tables illuminated Daniel's profile as he played. Despite the rough beard and longer hair, despite the worn clothes and tired eyes, she was beginning to recognize the face she had seen in newspapers and concert programs years ago. "Excuse me," she said quietly to Vincent, who was standing nearby watching in amazement. "Do you know this man's name?" "He said his name was Daniel," Vincent replied, never taking his eyes off the piano. "But that's all I know." Catherine's heart began to pound. Daniel. It was a common enough name, but combined with what she was seeing and hearing, the pieces were falling into place. She approached the piano carefully, not wanting to disturb the performance. Daniel's eyes were closed again, lost in the music. His entire body moved with the rhythm, swaying slightly as the melodies rose and fell. When he opened his eyes for a moment and saw the elderly woman standing nearby, he smiled slightly but kept playing. Catherine looked directly into his eyes, and in that instant she was certain. "My God," she breathed. Daniel continued playing, but something in the woman's expression made him pause slightly. Did she recognize him? After all this time, after everything that had happened, was it possible someone from his old life was here? Catherine turned back to Vincent with tears streaming down her face. "Do you realize who this is?" she asked, her voice shaking with emotion. Vincent looked confused. "I'm sorry, what do you mean?" "This is Daniel Chen. He was the principal pianist for the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. He played Carnegie Hall when he was just 25 years old. He was one of the most promising classical musicians of his generation." The words hit Vincent like a physical blow. He stared at the man playing piano in his restaurant with new eyes. "A principal pianist for the Chicago Symphony, Carnegie Hall? Are you sure?" Vincent asked. Catherine nodded emphatically. "I taught at the conservatory for 30 years. I remember when he first started getting attention. The newspapers called him a prodigy. He was supposed to be the future of classical music in America. The businessman in the gray suit had overheard part of the conversation. He leaned closer, straining to catch every word. But if he's so famous, what's he doing? Vincent's voice trailed off as the implications hit him. I don't know, Catherine said sadly. Something must have happened. Something terrible. Daniel had moved into a new piece now, something that sounded like it might be his own composition. The melody was haunting and beautiful, filled with pain and loss but also with hope. It sounded like the story of a life that had fallen apart and was trying to find its way back together. Catherine remembered reading about Daniel in the music magazines 5 or 6 years ago. There had been a scandal of some kind, though the details were fuzzy in her memory. Something about his family, a tragedy, and then he had simply disappeared from the classical music world. I need to make a phone call, Catherine said to Vincent. I have friends in the music community who will want to know about this. But Vincent caught her arm gently. Maybe we should let him finish playing first. Catherine nodded, realizing that interrupting this performance would be like stopping a miracle in progress. Word was spreading quietly through the restaurant. The businessman had whispered to his companion, who had told the people at the next table. Within minutes, half the dining room knew they were listening to a world-class musician who had once played on the most prestigious stages in the world. The young man who had been so eager to mock Daniel earlier now felt sick to his stomach. He thought about the video he had almost posted online, making fun of someone he assumed was just a homeless person trying to get attention. The realization of how wrong he had been hit him like a truck. We were going to humiliate him, he whispered to his friends. We were going to put him on social media and laugh at him. His friend, who had been recording earlier, had already deleted the video. How were we supposed to know? Maybe that's the point, the third member of their group said quietly. Maybe we shouldn't assume we know anything about people just by looking at them. The teenage girl who had been live streaming was now frantically typing updates to her followers. Guys, I found out who this is. This man is like a famous pianist. This is actually incredible. I can't believe what's happening right now. Her chat was exploding with comments and questions. Some viewers were asking her to keep the stream going, while others were already trying to research Daniel's background online. Daniel seemed oblivious to the growing recognition around him. He was completely absorbed in the music, playing pieces that seemed to tell the story of his journey. The notes spoke of triumph and failure, of dreams achieved and dreams lost, of hitting bottom and finding the strength to keep going. The woman at table 12, who had been so angry about the disruption earlier, was now crying openly. Richard, I feel so ashamed, she whispered to her husband. How could we have judged him like that? Her husband squeezed her hand. We didn't know. None of us knew. But deep down they both realized that their reaction had nothing to do with knowing or not knowing. They had judged Daniel based on his appearance, pure and simple. And they weren't the only ones. Vincent was struggling with a mix of emotions. He felt proud that he had given Daniel a chance when others might not have. But he also felt guilty about his own hesitation, about the way he had worried more about his restaurant's reputation than about helping a fellow human being. Catherine had pulled out her phone and was quietly making calls to contacts in the classical music world. Word was already starting to spread beyond the restaurant walls. As Daniel played, his story was slowly coming together from whispered conversations and half-remembered news articles. A rising star who had lost everything, a man who had reached the pinnacle of success only to fall into darkness. And now somehow he was here, sharing his gift with a room full of strangers who had almost missed the miracle happening right in front of them. The music built to another crescendo, and everyone in Giovanni's restaurant realized they were witnessing something they would never forget. Daniel's fingers moved through the final movement of his impromptu concert with breathtaking beauty. The piece he was playing now seemed to be his own creation, born from years of pain and struggle but ending with something that sounded like hope. Each note carried the weight of his journey from the heights of fame to the depths of despair, and now perhaps to something new. The entire restaurant had become a cathedral of sound. Not a single person was eating anymore. Waiters stood frozen with plates in their hands. The kitchen staff had gathered in the doorway, tears streaming down their faces. Even the busboys had stopped clearing tables to listen. As the music reached its final crescendo, Daniel's whole body swayed with the melody. His eyes were closed, and for the first time in months, his face looked peaceful. The lines of worry and hunger seemed to fade away, replaced by the pure joy of making music again. The last note lingered in the air for what felt like forever. When the sound finally faded into silence, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The moment was too precious to break. Then Professor Catherine started clapping. Slowly at first, then with growing enthusiasm. One by one, the entire restaurant joined in. The applause grew louder and louder until it became thunderous. People were standing now, giving Daniel the kind of ovation usually reserved for concert halls and opera houses. Daniel opened his eyes and looked around the room in shock. The faces staring back at him were filled with admiration, respect, and something he hadn't seen in a very long time: recognition of his worth as a human being. "Bravo," someone shouted from the back of the restaurant. "Incredible," called another voice. The young businessman who had been planning to mock Daniel was now clapping harder than anyone else, tears of shame and amazement running down his cheeks. His friends were doing the same, all of them understanding how close they had come to missing something truly extraordinary. Vincent approached the piano with his own eyes wet with tears. "Daniel," he said, his voice shaking with emotion, "I had no idea. I'm so sorry for how I treated you earlier." Daniel stood up slowly from the piano bench, overwhelmed by the response. "You gave me a chance when no one else would," he said quietly. "That means everything to me." Professor Catherine pushed through the crowd that had gathered around the piano. "Daniel Chen," she said, her voice filled with warmth, "I knew your parents. I was there the night you played Rachmaninoff with the symphony for the first time. You were magnificent then, and you're magnificent now." Daniel's face showed surprise and then deep emotion. "Professor Mills, from the conservatory?" "Yes, dear. And I want you to know that there are people who never stopped believing in you, even when you disappeared." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. He had spent so many months feeling forgotten, feeling like his old life had been just a dream. To know that someone remembered, that someone still believed in him, was almost too much to bear. The woman at table 12 approached hesitantly. "Sir, I owe you an apology. My husband and I, we judged you unfairly. We were wrong, and I'm deeply sorry." Her husband nodded in agreement. "Your music. It was the most beautiful thing I've heard in years. Thank you for sharing it with us." Similar apologies came from around the room. The teenage girl who had been live streaming approached with her phone still recording, but this time with respect. "Mr. Chen, would it be okay if I told my followers about what happened here tonight? But in a good way. To show them how wrong it is to judge people by how they look." Daniel nodded, touched by her sincerity. "I think that would be a good lesson for everyone." Vincent stepped forward again. "Daniel, I don't know what brought you to my restaurant tonight, but I'm grateful it happened. Would you consider playing here regularly, as our pianist? I can offer you a salary and—" He paused, looking around at his staff who were all nodding encouragingly. "We can help you get back on your feet." The offer hung in the air like music itself. Daniel looked around the room at all the faces watching him hopefully. Just hours ago, these same people had seen him as a nuisance, a disruption to their pleasant evening. Now they were offering him a chance at a new life. "I would be honored," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. The applause started again, even louder this time. Professor Catherine stepped closer. "Daniel, I'm going to make some phone calls tonight. There are people in the music world who need to know you're alive and playing again. The Chicago Symphony has a new music director, and they're always looking for guest artists. Your story, your music tonight, it could inspire so many people." Over the next hour, as the restaurant slowly returned to normal, person after person approached Daniel. Business cards were exchanged. Phone numbers were shared. The businessman in the gray suit, who had been making jokes earlier, turned out to be a talent agent. He wanted to discuss booking opportunities. "I represent several venues in the city," he explained, still looking ashamed of his earlier behavior. "After what I heard tonight, I think we need to talk about getting you back on stage where you belong." The young men who had been planning to humiliate Daniel online were now asking how they could help, spread the word about his talent in positive ways. They wanted to use their social media reach to help rebuild his career rather than tear him down. A food blogger who had been dining alone in the corner approached Vincent. "I'm going to write about tonight," she said. "Not just about the food, but about what happened here. About second chances and seeing people for who they really are." As the evening wound down, Daniel found himself surrounded by support he hadn't felt in years. Vincent had already arranged for him to stay in a small apartment above the restaurant until he could get back on his feet. Several customers had left generous tips specifically for him, but more than the money or the job offer, it was the restoration of his dignity that meant the most. The teenage girl's live stream had been shared thousands of times. Videos of Daniel's performance were already going viral, but this time the comments were filled with admiration and respect. People were sharing their own stories about times they had judged others unfairly. Professor Catherine was true to her word. By the next morning, Daniel's phone was ringing with calls from music directors, concert promoters, and journalists who wanted to tell his story of redemption. 6 months later, Daniel walked onto the stage at Symphony Center in Chicago, the same stage where he had once played as principal pianist. This time, he was the guest soloist playing a concerto he had written during his time on the streets. The piece told the story of loss and recovery, of hitting bottom and finding hope in unexpected places. In the audience that night sat Vincent and his staff from Giovanni's restaurant. Professor Catherine was there, beaming with pride. The young businessmen who had almost mocked him were in the front row, now some of his biggest supporters. The teenage girl was live streaming again, but this time to share a story of triumph. As Daniel's fingers touched the keys for the first time in that concert hall since his fall from grace, he thought about the night that changed everything. The night he asked for a plate of food and found so much more. He had learned that sometimes the greatest performances happen not on grand stages, but in small moments when we choose to see the humanity in each other. The music began, and once again Daniel Chen reminded the world that true artistry can never be silenced. No matter how far someone falls, it just waits patiently for the right moment to rise again.